So here we are on Digestive Physiology PowerPoint number 4. We finished last time looking in the stomach at the gastric pits, which opened into gastric glands. Now let's take a close-up look at those gastric glands. So there are mucus cells that secrete mucus. Remember, keep it sliding. Have to make sure the chyme and all the contents will be able to move easily. Regenerative cells. So think about this. If your stomach can digest a piece of steak, why doesn't it digest itself? And the answer is it does. You constantly are digesting your own stomach. So there have to be lots of regenerative cells. You have to keep making new cells so that you can replace the ones that you digested. Parietal cells. Parietal cells are very important. They secrete hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. Hydrochloric acid is the acid that actually tears apart cell walls and breaks down meat and plants. Intrinsic factor, unfortunately, we skipped the blood disorders. Intrinsic factor is necessary to absorb vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is needed for cell division, and because some of the fastest dividing cells in your body are red blood cells as they're being made in the red bone marrow, a deficiency of vitamin B12 leads to something called pernicious anemia. There are many different kinds of anemia, but if you have pernicious anemia, you can't make enough red blood cells, therefore you can't supply your blood with enough oxygen. So intrinsic factor is necessary to absorb vitamin B12. Even if you have vitamin B12 in your diet without intrinsic factor, you can't absorb it. There are people who are born with a genetic defect where they cannot make intrinsic factor. That's called pernicious anemia. Chief cells, these are the ones that secrete pepsinogen. So remember, we've seen this a bunch of times. Anything that ends in ogen is a zymogen. It's an inactive form of something. So, and what do you get when it becomes active? You just chop off the ogen. Pepsinogen becomes pepsin. Pepsin gets named because it produces peptides. It takes proteins, which are strings of amino acids, and breaks them down into shorter strings of amino acids, which are what peptides are. Peptides are basically small proteins. So that's what chief cells do. They break down proteins. Make that chart, make that table, kids. Every one of these secretions, what it is, where it's secreted, where it does its job, and what it actually does. Enteroendocrine cells secrete histamine plus some other hormones and paracrine messengers that we'll look at later. Histamine, we've already seen before. It's a vasodilator and a bronchoconstrictor. In the stomach, histamine stimulates the parietal cells to secrete the HCl. So notice we've got cells influencing other cells. And finally, the G cells produce gastrin. That's easy to remember. G for G cell, G for gastrin. And gastrin is it's a hormone that stimulates the secretion of hydrochloric acid by the parietal cells. Lots of secretions, you guys. You got to get those under control. Make that table, make that chart. Again, some of the little memory aids you can use, make up your own. Here's one that I use. Oop, I talked over the transition. Those words may not have come through. Chief Dan George was a movie actor. He died several years ago. He was great. He played funny parts. He was in The Outlaw of Josie Wales, a great Clint Eastwood movie. You should watch that. He was hilarious. But he was a Cherokee chief who became a movie actor. So way I remember is I think of Chief Pepsi. And that's because the chief cells secrete pepsinogen. See, that's how dumb and simple I am. There's a view of a gastric pit, and there's a gastric gland down inside the gastric pit, and there's a summary of the different cells and what they do. So, gastric secretions. You make 2 to 3 liters of gastric juice every day. That's water, hydrochloric acid, pepsin, and all the other little enzymes and hormones down there. So 2 to 3 liters, that's 2 to 3 quarts of Gatorade, think of it. Parietal cells contain carbonic anhydrase. We saw this when we did the blood before. So this equation, which will never go away again, we'll see it again when we do the urinary system, Carbon dioxide merges with water, makes carbonic acid, dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen. Well, this equation now, this reaction, is going to serve a useful purpose because it's going to help us make the stomach acid. You might think, how can we keep acid inside of our body? Well, we don't really. We make it when we need it. And here's how we make it. So hydrogen is pumped into the stomach lumen, the hollow space inside the stomach, by the H plus K plus ATPase. In other words, the hydrogen potassium pump. What it does is it pumps hydrogen out and potassium in. And isn't that where potassium would want to go anyway? Remember, first day of class we covered this. Potassium, the main cation of the intracellular fluid. When we saw the chloride shift in the blood, the idea was to get chloride in just to even out the number of negative ions, and we had to dump the bicarbonate into the blood in order to serve as a buffer. And then remember, carbon dioxide travels as bicarbonate ion to the lungs where it's then exhaled. So what's going to happen now is, instead of just chloride just being in there to balance out the positives and negatives, chloride is what we use to make the hydrochloric acid. So we pump it out to join the hydrogen, all right? So take a look here. You can see in that diagram on the lower right, look what happens. Carbon dioxide comes in from the blood, goes through the interstitial fluid into the parietal cell. This would be on the lining of the stomach, of the gastric gland rather. And then notice what's going to happen. We're going to have that reaction again. We're going to make carbonic acid. Look what happens now though. The hydrogen gets pumped into the stomach and it's exchanged with potassium to keep the positive ions balanced. Then the bicarbonate gets dumped into the blood. Likewise, chloride gets pulled out of the blood through the parietal cell into the stomach, where we now have hydrogen and chloride. We have hydrochloric acid. Now, because all that bicarbonate ion is getting dumped into the blood, that means that the pH of the blood, right as it leaves the stomach, is much higher than normal, and that's called the alkaline tide. There you go. Bicarbonate in the blood causes the alkaline tide. So ultimately, it's all going to even out. But if you were to sample blood right as it leaves the stomach, it would have a much higher pH than normal, the alkaline tide. So what does hydrochloric acid do? It activates pepsin and lingual lipase. So again, lingual lipase secreted in the mouth doesn't become active until it hits the stomach, where hydrochloric acid activates it. Breaks up connective tissues and plant cell walls. So it really just tears down meat and vegetables. Liquefies the food to form chyme. Chyme is a soupy-like mixture in the stomach. That's what all the food you eat turns into, this soupy stuff called chyme. Hydrochloric acid also will kill bacteria and pathogens. So remember, first line of defense, that piece of pizza sat on the counter all night. You decided to eat it anyway. Well, you might have lucked out. Stomach acid killed all that bad stuff. There in the upper right-hand corner, you see hydrochloric acid, very destructive. In high school, when we had the free period, whatever that was called, I don't even remember. High school was over 50 years ago for me. But a bunch of us would sneak out and go to the chemistry lab. And we would get the hydrochloric acid, and we would have contests to see who could drop the most on their skin. It was cool to watch your skin like smoking and burning. I won a couple of times, but mostly there were other guys who were better than me. Other gastric secretions, intrinsic factor. I mentioned this before. Need it to absorb B12. If you don't have that, you can't make enough red blood cells. You get pernicious anemia. Pepsin takes proteins and chops them down into smaller ones. Secreted as the zymogen, pepsinogen inactive. Then hydrochloric acid is what actually turns pepsinogen into pepsin. See, secretions affecting other secretions. Make that table, make that chart. It's hard to keep all this straight just in your head. It's easier if it's all written down in front of you. Gastrin stimulates the release of hydrochloric acid, also stimulates the release of histamine from the enteroendocrine cells. And gastric lipase and chymosin, two other enzymes in the stomach, they digest milk, butterfat. also curdles the milk. Okay, here you see a nice little picture of how pepsin is produced by hydrochloric acid working on pepsinogen. Again, the zymogen chop off a piece, then it becomes active. And look what it does. It takes big proteins, breaks them up into smaller peptides. So motility, things have to move. So swallowing center in the brainstem signals the stomach to relax. Food stretches the stomach, activating the receptive relaxation response. Here's what happens. The stomach is a muscle. You don't want it to just completely turn floppy. So as food tries to enter the stomach, it resists a little bit and sort of grudgingly expands. That helps the stomach stay tight so that the muscles can mash up the food, and also so that it keeps the food in direct contact with all that hydrochloric acid and all the pepsin and everything else, okay? Resist stretching briefly, relaxes to hold more. Then peristalsis. There are pacemaker cells, just like the heart had pacemakers. There are pacemaker cells in the longitudinal muscle layer. And what they do is they produce a wave of contraction, a gentle ripple about every 20 seconds that churns and mixes the food with the gastric juice. That's what keeps things moving along. There's a stronger contraction at the pyloric region. It ejects about 3 mils into the duodenum through the, remember, the pyloric sphincter, the pyloric valve. Typical meal emptied from the stomach in about 4 hours. This is one of the things that the forensic pathologists do. You know, if there's a crime scene, you try to figure out when did the person die. There are lots of things they do, like take the liver temperature and all kinds of stuff. But one thing they do is examine the stomach contents. And like if the person's, got a receipt in their pocket saying they ate at this restaurant at, 7:30, you can, based on how much of the meal is digested, you can give another estimate to the time of death. Wouldn't that be exciting to be a forensic pathologist? Look at the partially digested innards of somebody's stomach. Okay, so vomiting, formerly known as emesis, induced by a lot of things. If you eat too much food and your stomach overstretches, that can cause you to vomit. Psychological stimuli. I remember one time my sister was sick, and she was feeling very upset, and I said, "How would you like a nice greasy pork chop?" And she puked right there. So I remember in college too, freshman year, we were all drinking illegally, and I normally was pretty good at not getting sick, but when other people started puking, I had to get out of there because the smell was enough to make me start. So the emetic center in the medulla, remember medulla oblongata, the reflex, emergency reflex, survival reflex control center of the brain, that first causes what's called retching. We relax the lower esophageal sphincter, and then the stomach and duodenum contract spasmodically and force the contents up. You felt that before when you throw up. You can feel it coming up your esophagus. And then what happens when it gets up higher up into the pharynx, that's where vomiting occurs when you relax the upper esophageal sphincter, okay? That gives you a chance sometimes, if you know you're getting sick, you can hold it in with the upper esophageal sphincter until you can get someplace where you can let it go. Bleh. Just like that pumpkin. Bleh. Okay, here you go. Chloride shift results in a surge in bicarbonate ion in the blood leaving the stomach. This is called what? The crimson tide, the rising tide, the alkaline tide, the all-temperature tide, or the all-temperature tide with bleach. Pause the video, select your answer, then move on. Here you go. It is indeed the alkaline tide. There you go. Alkaline crimson tide, by the way, refers to the University of Alabama. Their football coach back in the 60s, Paul Bear Bryant, last real damn football coach in America. There you go with the crimson tide. There's the all-temperature tide. Here you go. Ulcers, peptic ulcers found in the duodenum, usually, not the stomach. Found both places. They're basically sores. They're like lesions in the stomach. They're very painful. So here's a nice picture slide that has the picture of what is in text on the next slide. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, but you can come back to this slide to see the picture of how it works. So gastric function, they say it has 3 phases. The first phase is cephalic. Cephalic, cephalos, Greek root word, refers to the head. So this is the thinking phase. Just the sight, smell, taste, or thought of food. Just imagining good food can cause your stomach to start releasing acids and enzymes and everything. It's all from the vagus nerve. Remember, that's 80 to 90% of all parasympathetic outflow. The gastric phase comes next, activated by the actual presence of food or semi-digested protein in the stomach itself. By stretch as well, by the increase in pH, all right? Secretions stimulated by acetylcholine. Remember, that is the neurotransmitter of the parasympathetic nervous system. And histamine, that's the one that stimulates the secretion of hydrochloric acid by the parietal cells. Gastrin from the pyloric G cells, that stimulates the parietal and the chief cells. Again, notice how all these secretions are influencing each other. Make that chart, kids. You're going to need it. And so finally, the third phase, the intestinal phase, duodenum regulates gastric activity through hormones and nervous reflexes. We're going to see more of that coming up when we get to the intestine. At first, gastric activity increases when the duodenum is stretched, but then we have the enterogastric reflex. This is important. I want you to know this. So what happens is, when food hits the duodenum sends signals back to the stomach saying, "Hey, bub, slow down." Do you see how that makes sense? In other words, once stuff gets into the intestine now needs time to work on it. So it tells the stomach, "Hey, slow down. We're busy down here. We got work to do. Hold off a little." Very important. You don't want stuff moving into the duodenum if it's not ready to handle it yet. That's the enterogastric reflex. Duodenum inhibits the stomach, okay? Caused by acid and semi-digested fats in the duodenum. And chyme is going to stimulate these duodenal cells to release a bunch of things: hormones, secretin, CCK, cholecystokinin, and GIP, which has a very interesting story behind it. Easy way to remember that is gastrointestinal peptide, but it really it had a different original name that was much more sophisticated, and then they made it simpler. Okay, so there, nice showing just kind of how all these secretions are affecting one another, and how, by golly, you end up, there's a feedback loop here, okay? That feedback loop, just look that over, follow it through, take a few minutes, look at that. Here you go, Toro Week, Grand Canyon. As soon as this is over, if I'm still alive. It had just rained. Is that gorgeous or what? There's the Colorado River. I spent hours just walking the rim of the canyon. Okay, kids, I'll see you again in the next PowerPoint.